Start with breaking news about Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. The BBC understands that he has been arrested on suspicion of misconduct in public office. That's from our correspondent who has found that information out. Just for context, we heard this morning from the Prime Minister in an interview that nobody is above the law when he was asked about Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, but he declined to say whether the former prince should volunteer himself to the UK police. We now understand, though, that Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, the former Prince Andrew, has been arrested on suspicion of misconduct in public office.
Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to the PR Breakdown. I'm your host, Molly McPherson. And if you've been following along, you know I've been tracking the Epstein files stories for a beat. Not for the gossip, not for the tabloid angle, but because it is one of the most instructive crisis communication case studies any of us will ever have a front row seat to. And it seems like every week it gets bigger. Each week, more names, more consequences, more institutional squirming. This episode was supposed to be a look at more of the names and how they are responding to the reveal in the files, but I have to take a bit of a detour because of the recent legal escalation out of the UK, and that is the royal arrest, the institutional response, and a very interesting live that I had last week. So, having said this, let me tell you right now, this Friday, March 6th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, we're going to do a special royal family PR breakdown live. You can head over to YouTube or Substack to follow along on the live stream. Last week, when we were going to discuss the Epstein files, we spent some time on Andrew, and everyone in the chat not only wanted to talk about Andrew, but everyone had their own little tidbits to add about the royal family. So if you want to join us, bring your questions, bring your thoughts, bring your tidbits, because this one is going to be good. Now, let's talk about Andrew. The facts first. On February 19th, his 66th birthday of all days, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor was arrested by British police on suspicion of misconduct in public office. He wasn't arrested for any of the accusations that we heard about what he did with women, or particular with the late Virginia Giuffre. This is a case of them nabbing Andrew because of something that was found in the recent files release. The specific allegation is that while serving as a UK trade envoy, he shared confidential information with Jeffrey Epstein. And so he was arrested, held for several hours, and then released. So no charges have been filed yet, no bail conditions. He can travel freely and doesn't have to report to the police regularly. But here's what released under investigation actually means in the UK system. Based on my research, it doesn't mean that it's over. It means the Crown Prosecution Service now has to apply their evidential test. And is there enough evidence to charge? And their public interest test. Is it in the public interest to prosecute? I would think that it is. Both tests have to be met. And also there is a Crown Court backlog. So if this does go to charges and a jury trial, many of the legal analysts are saying that it could be years before it's actually heard. An important legal note, misconduct in public office in the UK carries a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. That's not a minor charge. That's as serious as it gets. Now, what else is being investigated? And this is where it gets more serious than most of the coverage is acknowledging. That the Thames Valley Police have confirmed two separate lines of investigation. First, as I said, the current misconduct charge tied to sharing information with Epstein. But second, a separate report about a woman allegedly taken to an address in Windsor in 2010 for what police describe as, quote, sexual purposes. That second allegation is being assessed in coordination with U.S. law enforcement. So properties linked to Andrew have been searched, including his homes in Sandringham, Now, as you can see in the coverage, the properties linked to Andrew have been searched. It is not a fishing expedition. You do not get search warrants without probable cause. And separately, there are growing calls in the U.S. for him to testify before Congress about his dealings with Epstein. Ooh, those are a lot of facts for you to absorb. Whew, a breath. We just laid out a lot of the facts, and I need to give you time to absorb all of it. Now let's move on to the royal fallout, because I'm looking at this from many different angles, one being the institutional picture. Because I do work with a lot of clients, I always look at the organization, the institution, in this case, the royal family, because this is where crisis communication gets really interesting. Now, you know, back in October of 2025, Andrew had to give up his royal styles and honors, including the Duke of York title. That came from his brother, King Charles, and the wider family. He is no longer styled as Prince Andrew in any official capacity. He is Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. He also lost Royal Lodge, and that's his longtime Windsor residence. He's now living on a smaller property on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk. Could you imagine how far this guy has fallen? And by all accounts, his entire life, he is, even up until the arrest, this is a man with an ego. But despite all of that, he does remain eighth in line to the throne under the current law. And the British government is now actively considering legislation to remove him from that line of succession entirely. So here, where it brings another layer of the story, the Charles versus the Elizabeth contrast. So the reporting, and I was listening to a lot of BBC reporting since last Friday. All the reports are drawing a very clear line between how the late Queen handled Andrew and how Charles is handling him. Reports are saying that those two brothers are not that close. Generational trauma brought down. Interesting. Elizabeth's instinct was to protect her rumored favorite child, but King Charles' posture is entirely different. He is stripping him of everything and essentially kicking him out of everything. So that contrast tells you everything where the palace sees in its interests right now. Now, the palace statement has been careful. The allegations are for Andrew to answer, not the royal family. That distinction is important. The institution also, since their last statement as well about Andrew, supports victims of sexual abuse. The institution wants to protect its own reputation from further damage. It's not just about King Charles. It's also the succession of William. But reading that carefully, it's not a defense. It is a very deliberate step back. The palace is not defending Andrew. They are managing their own exposure. So I think this is PR damage control, but it's also brothers. It's also family. So the crisis comms read here. Andrew's response pattern over the past several years is one of the most instructive examples I have of what I call this avoidance spiral. I wrote about it in Substack. I published it last Friday. When I woke up early on Friday morning, the first notification I saw was about Andrew. I was already up for at least an hour when I saw my first notification about Andrew. And my first thought was, oh, this is going to change my day, because I have to write something about it, talk about it, because I've been following him and following this tactic of step one, deny and deflect. You remember that Newsnight interview in 2019? I still use it as a teaching example, where he had no recollection, couldn't sweat due to a medical condition, remembered everything about bringing Beatrice, I believe, to the Pizza Express in Woking. Everything was specific. It was verifiable, but it had such ultimately damage. Everything he talked about was very specific, and anything that he wanted to have verified, it was ultimately incredibly damaging, because he looked guilty as he was saying it. It looked like he was deflecting, not just what he was saying. And the step two was a strategic withdrawal. He did disappear from public life. He let the institution, the royal family, absorb the heat, and he let time do the work. The next step, he relied on the institution for cover. As long as the palace was protecting him, keeping him at Royal Lodge, maintaining some normal connection, he had a buffer. And that buffer was his mom. And now that his brother, King Charles, is in charge, the next step, the institution withdraws and there is no buffer left and the legal system arrives. So when you build, so here's the lesson. When you build your entire crisis strategy on avoidance, no accountability, no royal statement, no attempt to get ahead of the story, you are not resolving the crisis. You're only delaying it. And delayed crises don't shrink. They accumulate interest. Speaking of interest, the Harry and Meghan angle. That is an observation that we have to point out before we move on here because I think it's genuinely, analytically relevant. Andrew's arrest doesn't just change his story. It changes Harry and Meghan's story too. For years, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex absorbed a disproportionate share of critical royal coverage. Some of it earned, a lot of it not. But the media always needs a villain. And with Andrew quietly sidelined, the tabloids found other targets in Harry and Meghan, primarily Meghan. Now, an actual villain is front and center. The narrative architecture of the royal family just shifted. The smartest thing Harry and Meghan can do right now is stay completely silent. Just keep going about their day, keep going about their business, and let this all play out. We'll get into that much more in depth on March 6th on our live. So the rest of the fallout. But now we have to touch base on the rest of the fallout. Who's down, who's dodging, who's surviving? Because we do have to bring it into the Epstein files because we are seeing so much of this crisis PR machinations happening behind the scenes. I looked at the New York Times because they were tracking every person who faced concrete consequences from the Epstein files. So let's just touch base on a couple of them and look for the teaching element, not the pile on because each one is its own case study. So let's walk through the ones that have made some of the headlines and look for the teaching angles here. And let's look at it as its own, as each one, and let's accountability and pressure. The first one, Les Wexner. He's the former Victoria's Secret CEO, also a major Republican donor. He has repeatedly said he was conned by Epstein, that he has no personal relationship with him, that he did nothing wrong. But if you listen to any podcast or you read any article, Les Wexner is tied so deeply to Epstein. The reason why we have an Epstein is because of a Les Wexner. And this was interesting. That came out a couple days ago. 4.5 hours into Wexner's deposition before the House Oversight Committee, Wexner was cut off by his own attorney with a very blunt warning. So before I play this viral clip, I just want warning language.
Answer the question. 5 words, okay? I think that I'm giving a long answer, but to understand in context. Because if I just say yes or no, you won't understand it. And I really want this whole group to understand it. And I never would have guessed I was being conned. Never, ever. But the deceit was so subtle. Yes, I never
answer the question.
Yeah, okay.
I'm sure we all appreciate the stories. We're just trying to answer the questions that they actually want to be answered.
Okay.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
I hope it is.
And could I ask you, I think you said in the last hour, it was your understanding that Mr. Epstein, while he was working for you, also had other clients. Is that right?
Yes.
So would that mean that his work for you, you understood it to be part-time?
I wouldn't describe it that way. You know, I knew it wasn't full-time. I thought it wasn't full-time because he had other clients of substance, real substance.
As a listener, it sounds like substantial demands that you're describing. You were, and of course are, one of the wealthiest people in the country, managing all of your personal affairs. I would think, would typically demand all of somebody's bandwidth. It sounds like that was an issue with the guy before Epstein. How was he able to do that job, but also do work for other clients at the same time?
Well, like Peg does the work now. I think you could supervise the work, overview it. Which isn't the work that I do, and say you could do really thorough work if you were doing it 3 or 4 days a month, certainly a week or a day a month, just focusing on these things because there were accountants and tax lawyers and other people. And then in setting up, as an example, I didn't have the idea to inventory furniture or valuables. It is how could you have all silverware in your house? And I didn't count forks and spoons, and it's like just that people could be walking out with forks and spoons. Gee, that's a good idea. We ought to have an inventory. Then there was I hired a lady to be like the house manager who had run the U.S. Embassy in Rome, and she said, "Yeah, I know how to do this." And I said, "Well, why don't we keep inventories of stuff?" And she said, "Well, yeah, I could do that." So she did that. That's kind of a puny example, but I wouldn't have had the idea. But then all the things were inventoried. That wasn't work for me or Jeffrey. It was just regularly done.
Answer the question. 5 words, okay? Answer the question.
Okay.
Wow. Wow, that's a bad clip. But what Wexner is doing is, in his testimony, is this narrowing denial. You make a very specific, very narrow claim to create distance from the scandal, and the evidence slowly fills the gap. And the more specific the denial, the worse it looks when it falls apart. Because now you don't just have the original problem, you have a credibility problem on top of it. So we have to keep watching Wexner because it's going to be a masterclass in something, either how to survive congressional scrutiny or how not to. Next person, Thomas Pritzker. He stepped down as executive chairman of Hyatt Hotels after the files revealed he was in regular contact with Epstein. Not before 2008 when Epstein took his plea deal, but after. Years after. So in crisis communications, the continued association problem is one of the most damaging patterns there is. And that is a problem that is following a lot of these people associated with Epstein. They still communicated with them after 2008. It's one thing to have known someone before a scandal, but it's completely different when you've maintained contact after they were convicted of sex crimes. Public perception, and juries, by the way, treat those two things very differently. I didn't know is defensible. I knew and continued the relationship is not. Another person, the press and the public, everyone looking at, particularly coming out of the Winter Olympics, is Casey Wasserman and the 2028 Olympics. Now, this one is textbook crisis amplification through secondary roles. Wasserman is the chairman of the LA 2028 Olympics. Emails surface, in the files, emails surfaced showing flirtatious messages to Ghislaine Maxwell. Dozens of musicians and performers left his talent agency. Now he's selling it. And he was selling it so quickly, it almost felt like it was okay to sell. I don't know. I don't know anything about this, but it happened so quickly to decide to completely let go of your agency. But I don't know. Who knows? Maybe he did decide to sell it after these files were released. But there's a lesson here. Your highest profile role determines the severity of your crisis. Because if Wasserman had been a private citizen, this may have been containable for him. But when you're a public face of not just your agency, so you let it go, but now the Olympics, that is a global symbol of integrity and youth and sports and teamwork. The bar is entirely different. So the context doesn't just shape the narrative here. It determines the consequence. So as of now, he is still the chair of the LA 2028 Olympics, but I don't know how he possibly could be. Think about the Winter Olympics. Think about all the stories about the Winter Olympics. Did you watch the women winning the gold medal hockey game? All the women competing. How could you watch females compete in the 2028 Olympics without thinking about Casey Wasserman? Or maybe you don't think about Casey Wasserman. Maybe you wouldn't by then. But right now, as they plan for it, I don't know. Next, Leo Botstein and Bard College. This is another one that I've been following. I posted something on social media when I was in Arizona last week. Actually, Greg and I were in Arizona, and he read the headline about Leo Botstein being found out in the files because he reported in New York for over 45 years. So he was quite familiar with Leon Botstein and Bard College. And he had noticed in this Time Union's article that his name came up and in the files, and his spokesperson came up with a rather sharp, curt response to his name being in there. So what's interesting is that Botstein doesn't have your typical college communication staff, your college communication staff responding for him. You know, it's not the same person who's writing a press release saying Bard College is coming out with this new event, or we now are offering Japanese sculpting classes. No, this is someone who has a long history, David Wade, working with Democrat politics. I mean, this guy is an operative. He is the person working with Leon Botstein, and he wrote a statement, and he likened it to, and it had one of those sharp, curt touches to it. On February 10th, the Times Union published a story by Sarah Tafton. In the files, it was said that Epstein told assistants to ensure the woman was, quote, appropriately dressed for Botstein. Ugh, that's not good. David Wade, in one of his statements, said that the email is impossible to interpret, quote, without a Ouija board. And I don't know if that's his way, very snarky way, of saying you can't prove anything. And if you do, you have to summon the ghosts or the dead to come up with the answer. It's something that you'll never be able to prove. Is that what you want from a college president? Now, as of now, Leon Botstein is still at Bard College, and the Board of Trustees have hired a law firm, Wilmer Hale, who have, and this is a firm that's been involved in a lot of the big cases there. So now Bard College is investing a lot of money into investigating its own president. There have been a lot of letters coming out to staff and to students and to alum because people are forwarding them to me. So until this independent review is complete, Botstein has led Bard for over 50 years. He raised millions to save the school from closure. And documents show he was corresponding with Epstein about music and watches and young female musicians. The Bard's board response was procedurally solid. They hired Wilmer Hale, a respected outside law firm who's been involved in a lot of big name court cases. They're now doing an independent review, and they promised to share the results. And they also acknowledge the community's pain, which is important. Here's a quote from the Bard board letter. "We recognize and feel how difficult this moment is for our community and the pain and concern that it has caused. That is acknowledging pain without admitting wrongdoing, expressing empathy without making a specific commitment, buying time while appearing responsive. This is a deliberately constructed sentence." Now, is the outside investigation a bad thing? No, it can be genuinely valuable. And it's important to have independent reviews. The question to ask, who hired the investigators? What is their mandate? When do we get results? Those three questions will tell you whether this investigation is substance or theater. Another interesting one is Goldman Sachs and Catherine Rumler. And here's a case of institutional silence as strategy. Rumler was a general counsel at Goldman, but before that, she was a top Obama administration lawyer. And emails have showed a deep friendship with Epstein. She was advising him on how to respond to questions about sex crimes while he was sending her gifts and career advice. She is now stepping down in June. Goldman's response, notably quiet. Almost no public statement. And that silence is itself a communication choice. So when an institution says almost nothing about a departing executive who's caught up in the scandal, the silence signals we are not defending this person and we want distance. Goldman doesn't need to say that out loud. The silence says it for them in this case. And it actually protects the institution better than any statement would in this case, because a statement creates a record to be picked apart. This story is one that I believe illustrates how Epstein was able to get into such elite circles, but also to bring people in who wanted to be in elite circles. If you work for an administration, and in this case, Rumler worked for Obama, you have power, but you don't have money. You don't have income because you're a public servant. The money's not there. The money comes after. Naturally, she landed at Goldman Sachs. So it's not surprising to see people who get caught up in it when there are gifts involved and when there's access to power, which is so much about what this story is. It's an elitist story, not just a billionaire story, but an elitist story. That brings me to the next person, Howard Lutnick. He's the Commerce Secretary. And Lutnick acknowledges encounters with Epstein after he claimed he'd cut ties, important to note. Now, there have been a lot of calls for his resignation. And talk about a guy whose reputation has changed so significantly since 9/11. I mean, we're coming up to a very, very important milestone, an anniversary, if you will, for 9/11 on September 11, 2026. And if you think back to the coverage of Lutnick, who ran Cantor Fitzgerald, who was bringing his son to kindergarten that day, who lost his brother, who lost so many employees there. I mean, he was a sympathetic figure for so long. But now he's another guy who's flying in these circles. He has two sons who are deep into making profit off of where Howard Lutnick rests now within the administration. The New York Times did a great deep dive on the Lutnick family. He's currently still in his seat, but what does that tell us? Political cover changes the accountability calculus. It doesn't change what happened. It doesn't change the facts, but the administration is 100% going to stand by Lutnick. I mean, this is still crisis communication at work, but not for the sake of doing the right thing. This is crisis communication with power. So the 5 patterns that come out of today's podcast from these stories, let's step back. It's across all the cases: Andrew, Wexner, Pritzker, Wasserman, Botstein, Rumler, Lutnick. The same patterns keep showing up. And these are patterns that crisis communicators, crisis managers advise their clients. So when you analyze these crises in real time, or even when you're in the situation yourself, you can look for these patterns. Pattern 1, the continued association problem. Before the conviction is defensible, after the conviction is not. That line matters enormously to public perception and to juries. So for lawyers, they have to know where their client sits relative to that line. Pattern 2, the narrowing denial. The more specific the denial, the more damage when it falls apart. A narrow claim creates a narrow gap, and evidence fills that gap. It's better to acknowledge broadly and let the investigation run than make claims that documents can contradict. And the internet is going to contradict. Andrew's going to say that, oh, well, I can't sweat. The internet will find photos of you sweating. That's why it's so difficult to do. Pattern 3, the institution abandonment sequence. Institutions protect the individual as long as the cost of protection is manageable. The royal family, Goldman Sachs, the moment the cost exceeds the benefit, they step back quietly without fanfare. If the institution goes silent, that's the signal. That is the signal that the person is on their own. Pattern 4, the outside investigation gambit. So not inherently dishonest. It can be genuinely valuable, but questions to ask. Who hired them? What's the mandate? When are the results? The answers tell you if it's substance or theater. We'll see. We will see with Bard. In many cases, they want to do an investigation because they hope the news dies down and no one pays attention. But in today's content-driven market, people will pay attention and people will be watching, including me. And pattern 5, context determines the consequence. The same conduct creates very different crises depending on the public role. So a private citizen compared to the chairman of the Olympics, they're not equivalent. The highest profile position sets the bar for everything else. So what is this really all about? Let's end on something that's bigger than the tactics here. Every single person in these files made choices. Some were made with ignorance, some in complicity, some out of ambition or greed, some willful blindness. But now those choices are public record. There are 3 million pages of them. Crisis communications helps you navigate the aftermath. It can create, and that's where crisis communication comes in, because it helps navigate the aftermath. It shapes narrative. It preserves reputations. It protects an institution, but it cannot manufacture integrity. That was never there. That's the line drawn for me in my business. I did an interview last week with WCVB. They're the ABC affiliate out of Boston. And one of the questions the producer asked me, where do you draw the line with clients? And I mentioned, there are third rails in my business that I won't touch. I would never be hired as a PR fixer. If someone wanted to get out of something, that's not me. I'm the person you hire to get through it. So I do not manufacture integrity. I need to work with people who have integrity, but perhaps momentarily lost it, or they lost their way, or they got scared, and now they need help. And it's what I keep coming back to. And it's what I teach in my monthly membership lessons in my Substack membership, is that the best crisis communication happens before the crisis. It happens in the choices you make when nobody's watching, because eventually somebody always is. Andrew knew that. Wexner knew that. Pritzker knew that. They all bet the documents would stay sealed forever, and they were wrong. So want to be a part of the conversation? Join me Friday, March 6th for a PR Breakdown live. Let's go deep in the royal family. Let's talk about Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. Let's talk about the former Prince Andrew and his legal situation. Let's talk about Harry and Meghan and Wills and Catherine and the Duke and Duchess of Sussex and the Prince and Princess of Wales. Let's talk about King Charles and Queen Camilla. Let's talk about all of it. Bring your questions, your thoughts, and your tidbits. All the information located in the show notes. And if this kind of analysis is useful to you or interesting, this is what I do often in my vault, as in what's said in it stays in it. You can join my Substack. The link, again, you can find the link in the show notes. You can always be a part of the community, or you can just subscribe and get links to important information. That's all for this week for this edition of the podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Bye for now.